The desert sun had branded Jacob Kane's face with stories he never wanted to tell, scars that twisted across his left cheek like lightning frozen in flesh, reminders of a day when everything he'd known had burned to ash. He rode into the canyon country that autumn morning with nothing but a weary horse, a battered saddle, and the kind of silence that settles into a man's bones when words have failed him too many times. The Apache lands stretched before him, vast, unforgiving, beautiful in the way that only wild places can be. He wasn't running, not exactly, but he wasn't staying anywhere either. Men like Jacob existed in the spaces between belonging, drifters who'd learned that home was a luxury reserved for those who hadn't watched theirs collapse. He'd been riding for 3 weeks when he first saw the smoke signals rising against the copper sky. His gut told him to turn away. White men didn't wander into Apache territory without invitation, and Jacob had no desire to test his luck. But his horse was lame, limping badly after stepping wrong in a prairie dog hole 15 miles back. Pride wouldn't carry him another day without water and rest. So he rode toward the smoke, toward whatever fate waited there, knowing full well that some choices aren't really choices at all, just inevitabilities dressed up as decisions. The Apache warriors found him before he found them. They materialized from the rocks and scrub brush like shadows gaining form. 12 of them, maybe more, encircling him with the quiet efficiency of men who'd hunted these lands since before his grandfather was born. Jacob raised his hands slowly, keeping them visible, keeping his breathing steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. The leader stepped forward, a man whose face carried the weight of authority like a crown. His eyes measured Jacob with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading men's intentions in their posture, their eyes, their hands. This was Chief Takoda, though Jacob wouldn't learn his name until later. All he knew in that moment was that this man held his life in the balance, and the scales could tip either way. Jacob spoke no Apache. The warriors spoke little English, but fear, respect, exhaustion, these were languages that transcended words. When Jacob dismounted and knelt beside his injured horse, running careful hands over the swollen fetlock, something shifted in the air. The warriors watched him tend to the animal with a gentleness that seemed to surprise them. This scarred white man who spoke softly to a lame horse as if it could understand. Chief Takoda made a decision then. With a gesture, he indicated that Jacob should follow. The warriors didn't lower their weapons. Trust was something earned in inches, not granted in moments, but they allowed him passage. Jacob walked his limping horse through the canyon paths, surrounded by armed men, moving deeper into a world he didn't understand. Trusting in the only thing he had left to trust, the strange mercy of strangers. The village appeared like a mirage, skin lodges arranged in careful patterns, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing near the stream, women working hides and gathering water. Life, ordinary, beautiful, resilient life, in a place Jacob had been taught to fear. The village stopped its rhythm as they entered. Eyes tracked him, curious, cautious, some openly hostile. He was an outsider here, an intruder, a representative of a people who'd broken every treaty, stolen every promise, burned bridges that had taken generations to build. But Chief Takoda had granted him passage, and among the Apache, a chief's word carried the weight of law and honor combined. They took Jacob's horse to be tended. They gave him water. They pointed to a place where he could sit and wait, and wonder what mercy looked like in a language he couldn't speak. As the sun arced toward the western peaks, Jacob sat in the shade of a cottonwood and watched the village live its life around him. He saw young warriors practicing with bows, their movements fluid and precise, honed by years of necessity. He saw women weaving baskets with patterns so intricate they seemed to hold stories in their geometry. He saw elders sitting in council, their weathered faces maps of wisdom earned through survival. And he saw her, Aita moved through the village like water flowing downhill, natural, inevitable, graceful, in a way that transcended mere physical beauty. She was the chief's daughter. Anyone could see that in the way she carried herself, in the deference others showed her, in the quiet authority that radiated from her like heat from stone. Her hair was black as raven wings, her eyes darker still, and when she looked at Jakob across the village commons, he felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been dormant so long he'd forgotten it existed. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him beyond that single, measuring glance. But in that moment, Jakob understood that his life had just become infinitely more complicated, because some recognitions happen beneath words, beneath logic, beneath every careful wall we build around our hearts. She saw him, and in seeing him, she'd changed everything. As evening descended and cookfires painted the canyon walls with dancing light, Jacob learned why Chief Takoda had brought him here. Through halting English and expressive gestures, he understood. Aita had reached the age when tradition demanded she choose a husband. 12 warriors from surrounding clans had come to compete for her hand, men of strength and reputation, proven hunters and fierce protectors. The trials would begin at dawn. 3 days of tests designed to prove which man possessed the courage, skill, and endurance worthy of a chief's daughter. Jakob wasn't competing. He was simply there, an accidental witness to something ancient and sacred, counting the hours until his horse healed enough to carry him away from this place and back into his comfortable, lonely exile. That was the plan. That was the sensible path forward. But fate, that old trickster, had other plans entirely. Dawn broke over the canyon like a promise, gold light spilling down red stone walls, painting the world in shades of amber and rust. The 12 warriors gathered in the village center, and Jakob had never seen men carry themselves with such fierce pride. They were magnificent, each one a study in controlled power, decorated with symbols of their achievements. Weapons polished to mirror brightness, faces set with the determination of men who'd traveled far for this singular honor. There was Takoda's nephew, Kuruk, a man whose reputation as a hunter extended across 3 territories. There was Chaitan from the mountain clans, scarred from bear fights and enemy arrows, a warrior whose name alone made men careful. There was Kohana, Napishni, Enapai, names Jakob would learn later, men whose lives had been shaped by the hard truth that survival in this land required steel in the spine and fire in the heart. They stood in a semicircle before Chief Takoda's lodge, waiting for Aita to emerge and make her choice. Tradition held that she would walk among them, studying each warrior, and then indicate her selection. That man would earn the right to compete in the trials. The others would depart with honor, their courage in presenting themselves acknowledged and respected. The village gathered, every soul who could walk assembled to witness this moment. Jacob sat apart near the horse corrals, assuming his role as observer. He tied his bandana to hide the worst of his scars. Old habit, old shame. The mark of a man who'd learned that people's eyes lingered too long on damage they couldn't understand. When Aita emerged from her father's lodge, the morning seemed to pause. She wore traditional dress, white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork, her hair braided with shells and feathers, her bearing regal yet somehow vulnerable in a way that made Jakob's chest tighten. She was 18 summers old, standing at the threshold of a choice that would define her entire existence. And the weight of that responsibility showed in the careful way she moved. She began her walk among the warriors. Each one stood taller as she approached, displaying their strength, their worthiness, their desire to be chosen. Kuruk flexed his bow arm. Chaitan lifted his chin, showing the scars that proved his survival. Others demonstrated their weapons, their regalia, their family lineage through gesture and presence. Aita studied them all with dark, unreadable eyes. The silence stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring, nobody daring to breathe too loudly lest they disturb the sacred nature of this selection. She completed her circuit of the 12 warriors, and then something no one expected. She kept walking. Confusion rippled through the crowd. The warriors exchanged glances. Had she seen something that displeased her? Had tradition been broken somehow? Chief Takoda stepped forward, concern creasing his weathered face. But Ayita raised one hand, asking for patience, asking for trust, and continued her path through the village. She walked directly toward Jacob. He didn't understand at first, thought perhaps she was heading toward the corrals, or the stream beyond, or anywhere except... But no. She stopped in front of him, this scarred white drifter with dust on his boots and exhaustion in his eyes. This nobody who'd stumbled into her world by accident and would vanish from it just as quickly. She stopped, and she looked at him with an intensity that stripped away every defense he'd ever built. And then, quietly, deliberately, with the kind of courage that moves mountains one stone at a time, she pointed at him. The village erupted. Warriors shouted in protest. Women gasped. Children stared with wide eyes. Chief Takoda's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock, confusion, anger, and something that might have been understanding buried deep beneath the surface. The 12 warriors surged forward, hands on weapons, voices raised in outrage at this unprecedented insult to their honor and tradition. Jakob stood slowly, hands raised, heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He didn't understand the words being shouted, but he understood the fury. He'd somehow become the lightning rod for a storm he never wanted to summon. He looked at Ayita, searching for explanation, and saw in her eyes something that terrified him more than all 12 warriors combined: certainty. She'd chosen him deliberately, intentionally, knowing full well what chaos it would unleash. Chief Takoda raised both arms, and the village fell into tense, trembling silence. He spoke, long, measured words in Apache that Jacob couldn't comprehend, but felt in his bones. This was a chief addressing his people, explaining, justifying, upholding tradition, while acknowledging that tradition sometimes bent in unexpected directions. When he finished, he turned to Jacob and spoke in careful English. "My daughter has chosen. By our laws, her choice must be honored. You will compete in the trials. If you succeed, you may marry her. If you fail, you will leave and never return." Jacob's mind raced. He could refuse, probably should refuse. He was an outsider, a drifter, a man with no roots and no future. He knew nothing about being a husband, let alone a husband in a culture he didn't understand. The smart move was to decline respectfully, wait for his horse to heal, and ride back into the anonymity he'd cultivated so carefully. But Ayita was still looking at him, still waiting, and in her eyes he saw something that shattered every reasonable objection. She'd taken an enormous risk by choosing him. She'd defied 12 warriors, challenged tradition, weathered the fury of her entire community. For him, for reasons he couldn't fathom, she'd seen something in this broken cowboy that made her believe he was worth the chaos. How do you walk away from that kind of faith? Jacob Kane had spent years running from commitment, from connection, from anything that might root him to the earth and make him vulnerable again. But standing there in the morning light, with an entire village watching and 12 warriors radiating murderous intent and one brave girl waiting for his answer, he made a choice that terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. He nodded to Chief Takoda. "I accept." The warriors' rage reached new heights. Kuruk stepped forward, spitting words in Apache that needed no translation. They dripped with contempt and challenge. Chief Takoda translated, "Kuruk says you are unworthy, a coward who hides behind a woman's foolish choice. He demands you prove yourself or die trying." Jacob met Kuruk's eyes, held that furious gaze without flinching, and said quietly, "Then let's see what I'm made of." The first trial would begin at noon, 3 trials over 3 days, tests designed to break men and reveal their true character. Tests that would require every ounce of courage, endurance, and will Jakob possessed. Tests that might very well kill him. But as the crowd dispersed and preparations began, Jakob felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not the aimless drifting that had defined his existence, but a reason to push forward, to endure, to prove that he was more than the sum of his scars and failures. Aita passed by him as she returned to her lodge. She didn't speak, couldn't, given the watchful eyes of her people, but her hand brushed his arm for just a heartbeat. That single touch carried more weight than 1,000 words. "I believe in you. Don't let me down. You're stronger than you know." Jakob stood alone in the village center as the sun climbed higher, feeling the weight of impossible expectations settling onto his shoulders, and wondering if faith alone could carry a man through fire. The canyon walls trapped heat like a stone oven. By noon, the temperature had climbed to the kind of punishing intensity that made breathing feel like swallowing knives. Perfect conditions for the first trial. Endurance. The test was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Each competitor would carry a massive stone up the canyon wall to a sacred site, nearly 500 feet above the valley floor. The path was steep, narrow, treacherous. The stone weighed as much as a grown man. There would be no rest stops, no water, no mercy from the sun that hammered down like a physical force. The 12 warriors stood ready, stripped to breechcloths, their bodies already glistening with sweat. They'd prepared for this, trained their entire lives for moments exactly like this. Their muscles were carved from years of hunting, fighting, surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They were built for this challenge. Jakob was not. He was lean from years in the saddle, strong enough from ranch work and trail living, but he'd never trained for something like this. Never needed to. He stood among the warriors feeling painfully aware of his inadequacy, the white cowboy who'd somehow stumbled into a contest designed for men who'd spent their entire lives preparing for this singular honor. Chief Dakota spoke to the assembled crowd, explaining the sacred significance of the stones they'd carry. Each one representing a burden, a responsibility, the weight of leadership and protection that a husband must bear. The warrior who reached the summit first would earn respect and advantage in the trials to come. The warrior who failed to reach it at all would be eliminated. They lined up at the base of the trail. Each man selected his stone from the pile, rough chunks of red sandstone, worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. Jakob hefted his assigned burden and felt his shoulders protest immediately. The stone was heavy, awkwardly shaped, difficult to grip, seemingly designed to maximize discomfort. He adjusted his hold, finding the least terrible position, and glanced up at the cliff face stretching above them. 500 feet, in this heat, carrying this weight without stopping. The insanity of what he'd agreed to hit him like a physical blow. But Aita stood with the watching crowd, her eyes finding his across the distance, and that look, fierce, proud, unwavering, reminded him why he was doing this impossible thing. Chief Dakota gave the signal. They began to climb. The warriors surged ahead immediately, carrying their stones with practiced efficiency. Kuruk led the pack, his hatred for Jakob fueling each powerful stride. Chaitan and Kohana followed close behind, their breathing controlled despite the murderous heat. They moved like machines, steady, relentless, unstoppable. Jakob fell behind within the first 50 feet. His arms burned, his shoulders screamed. The stone seemed to gain weight with every step, as if gravity itself had taken personal offense to his presence here. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, turning the dust on his skin to mud. The bandana he'd worn to hide his scars was soaked through within minutes. 100 feet up, his legs began to tremble. The trail was barely wide enough for one man, switchbacking up the cliff face at an angle that made every step a calculated risk. A stumble here meant a fatal fall. The stone in his arms blocked his view of his feet, forcing him to feel his way forward, trusting muscle memory and desperate instinct. 200 feet, and Jacob understood that this wasn't just a physical trial. The warriors were singing as they climbed, traditional songs that synchronized their breathing, focused their minds, connected them to something larger than individual suffering. They drew strength from their culture, their ancestors, their shared identity. Jacob had none of that. He had only himself, and the scar tissue memories of learning that survival meant putting one foot in front of the other, even when every fiber of your being screamed to stop. 250 feet, his vision started to tunnel. The sun was a malevolent god, pressing down with both hands, trying to drive him into the earth. His shoulders felt like they were tearing away from his spine. The stone slipped in his grip, and he nearly dropped it, nearly failed right there. But some deep, stubborn part of him refused. He adjusted his hold, took 3 rasping breaths, and continued climbing. 300 feet, the lead warriors were far ahead now, distant figures against the red stone. Jacob was in last place, alone at the back of the pack, exactly where everyone expected the white cowboy to be. He could imagine the whispers from below. He won't make it, he'll quit. He'll prove what we already knew, that Aita's choice was foolish, that he doesn't belong, that he'll fail. But Jacob Kane had learned something during the worst night of his life, the night his homestead burned, the night he got these scars, the night he lost everything. He learned that you don't survive by being the strongest or the fastest. You survive by being too stubborn to quit even when quitting makes perfect sense. 350 feet. His body was shutting down. He could feel it, the trembling in his legs, the weakness in his grip, the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. Part of him whispered that it was okay to stop, to set the stone down, to fail with dignity and walk away from this impossible situation. But then he thought about Aita's hand brushing his arm, that fleeting touch that said, "I believe in you." And he thought about all the times in his life he'd run instead of standing firm, all the moments he'd chosen the easy escape over the hard fight, all the years he'd spent drifting because drifting meant never having to risk failure or loss again. 400 feet, 100 feet to go. The summit was visible now, a flat shelf of rock where the other warriors had already begun gathering. Kuruk stood at the top, arms crossed, watching Jacob's agonizing progress with undisguised satisfaction. He wanted Jacob to fail, wanted to watch him break, wanted to prove that Aita's choice was a mistake. Jacob's foot slipped on loose gravel. He went to one knee, the stone crushing down on his chest, breath exploding from his lungs in a pained gasp. This was it, the moment where his body gave out, where physics and heat and exhaustion finally won. He could feel failure settling over him like a shroud. But then, from somewhere deep in his chest, came a sound, not a word, not a scream, a roar, raw, defiant, primal. The sound of a man who'd been counted out too many times and was done accepting other people's judgments of his worth. He pushed to his feet, stone still clutched to his chest, legs shaking so hard he could barely stand. And he climbed. 425 feet, 50 to go. Every step was a negotiation with his failing body. His legs were numb. His arms had ceased sending pain signals because pain had become the only language his nerves knew. He wasn't climbing anymore. He was crawling upward, one agonizing foot at a time, too far gone to quit, too stubborn to die. 450 feet, 25 to go. The warriors at the top had stopped talking. They were watching now, really watching, because something impossible was happening. This broken white man, who had no business being here, who should have quit 100 feet ago, who by all logic should be lying unconscious at the bottom of the cliff, was still coming. 475 feet. The summit was right there, right there. Jacob could see the faces of the warriors, Kuruk's satisfaction melting into disbelief, Chaitan's respect dawning reluctantly, Chief Takoda's eyes showing something that might have been approval. His foot found the final ledge. He hauled himself over the lip of the summit, stone still clutched in trembling arms, and somehow remained standing. For 5 long seconds he stood there swaying, death pale beneath the dirt and sweat, consciousness threatening to abandon him entirely. Then he walked forward on legs that had forgotten how legs worked, carried his stone to the sacred pile where the others rested, and set it down with the others. Last place. Dead last. Every single warrior had finished before him. But he'd finished. Against impossible odds, against his own body's betrayal, against the expectations of everyone watching. He'd finished. Jacob collapsed. Hands caught him, warriors' hands, easing him to the ground, offering water, speaking words he couldn't understand through the ringing in his ears. He lay there gasping like a landed fish, staring up at the merciless sky, wondering if he'd just proven himself or simply survived through dumb luck. When his vision cleared, he found Kuruk standing over him. The big warrior's face was unreadable. Anger and something else warring behind his eyes. He spoke in Apache, then repeated in broken English, "You should have failed, but you did not. This changes nothing." Jacob managed a weak smile. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," Kuruk agreed, and there was promise in that word. Promise of more pain, more trials, more chances for Jacob to break. But as they made their way down the cliff face, slowly, carefully, Jacob's legs barely functioning, he felt something stirring in his chest. Not confidence exactly, but recognition. He'd forgotten what it felt like to fight for something that mattered, to push past the limits of what seemed possible, to endure, not because it was easy, but because someone he barely knew had looked at him and seen something worth fighting for. The first trial was complete, 2 more remained, and Jacob Kane had just learned something terrifying and wonderful. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire. Jacob woke before dawn on the second day, unable to move. Every muscle in his body had seized during the night, his shoulders locked, his legs cramped into rigid agony, his hands curled into useless claws. He lay on the bedroll the Apache had provided, staring at the darkness inside the guest lodge, wondering if his body had finally decided to mutiny against the madness his mind kept demanding. It took him 20 minutes to sit up, another 10 to stand. Walking was generous to call it walking. He limped to the stream as the eastern sky began to pale, stripped off his shirt, and lowered himself into the cold water with a gasp that echoed off the canyon walls. The shock of it was exquisite and terrible, every nerve screaming protest while his abused muscles slowly, grudgingly began to unlock. He'd slept maybe 3 hours. Between the pain and the knowledge of what today's trial would demand, rest had been impossible. Chief Takoda had explained it the night before. The trial of courage. Each competitor would face a series of challenges designed to test not physical strength, but the steel of a man's character when confronted with primal fear. The first challenge was simple enough in description. Walk across a log, suspended 50 feet above the canyon floor. No rope, no safety measures, just a man, a log barely wider than his boot, and the rocks below waiting patiently for any mistake. The second challenge was worse. Enter a cave, known to house a mountain lion, and retrieve a token from deep within its den. The third, Chief Takoda had smiled grimly when describing it, would test whether a man could control his deepest instincts when faced with impossible choices. Jacob floated in the stream, letting the current pull away the worst of yesterday's exhaustion, and confronted an uncomfortable truth. He was afraid. Not the manageable fear that sharpens senses and quickens reflexes. The deep existential fear that whispers, "You're not enough. You've never been enough. You're going to fail and everyone will finally see what you've always known about yourself." But fear was an old companion. He'd learned to live with it the way you learn to live with a bad knee or a scar that aches in cold weather. You don't let it stop you. You just carry it along and do what needs doing anyway. The sun rose and the village stirred to life. Women prepared food. Children chased each other between lodges. Old men sat in council discussing matters of survival and tradition. Normal life continuing around the abnormal situation of these trials. Jakob dressed slowly, forcing his protesting body into movement, and made his way to the canyon's edge where the first challenge waited. The log stretched between two stone pillars like a bridge designed by someone with a cruel sense of humor, 50 feet straight down to jagged rocks and sparse brush. The log itself was old pine, weathered, uneven, slick in places where morning dew still clung. The warriors gathered along with much of the village. This trial was spectacle. Success was impressive, but failure would be memorable. Kuruk went first. He strode onto that log like he was walking across flat ground, arms loose at his sides, balance so perfect it seemed effortless. He made it across in under a minute, turned, and gave Jakob a smile that was all edges and threat. The message was clear. Match this, if you can. The other warriors followed, some faster, some more careful, but all of them crossing with the confidence of men who'd spent their lives in high places. Chaitan made a show of it, stopping halfway across to stretch his arms wide, demonstrating his fearlessness. Kohana ran across, footsteps barely touching wood, agile as a cat. Then it was Jakob's turn. He approached the log and felt his stomach drop. Up close it looked even narrower than from a distance, even more unstable. 50 feet wasn't a huge drop in abstract terms, but standing at the edge, looking down at those waiting rocks, 50 feet was forever. He'd never been comfortable with heights, had spent his life on horses and flat ground, avoiding situations exactly like this. His hands were slick with sweat. His legs still trembled from yesterday's climb. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was insane, that one slip meant death or crippling injury, that he had nothing to prove, that he could walk away right now and Ayita was watching, standing with the other women, her face composed but her eyes bright with, what? Hope? Fear? The weight of her choice pressing down on both of them? Jakob stepped onto the log. The world immediately tried to kill him. A gust of wind pushed him sideways. The log shifted under his weight, not much, but enough. His arms windmilled, body swaying, balance threatening to abandon him before he'd traveled 5 feet. Below he heard gasps from the watching crowd, Kuruk's satisfied chuckle. Don't look down. The oldest advice for heights. Jakob locked his eyes on the far pillar and took another step, then another. His boots felt too large suddenly, his legs too long, his body too clumsy for this kind of precision work. The wind picked up. Canyon breezes channeling through the rocks, pushing him, testing him, trying to pluck him off this narrow perch and dash him against the earth below. Halfway across, his foot slipped. His whole body dropped 6 inches before he caught himself, straddling the log now, arms wrapped around it in a desperate embrace. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Below, someone cried out. He couldn't tell if it was concern or mockery, probably both. He wanted to quit, wanted to crawl backward to safety and tell Chief Takoda that this was impossible, that he'd given it his best effort, but some things were simply beyond him. Nobody would blame him. They expected him to fail. He could accept failure with dignity and ride away from here with his life intact, if not his pride. But that thought, that tempting, reasonable thought, carried the bitter taste of every other time he'd quit when things got hard, every time he'd run instead of standing firm, every choice that had led him to this moment, 32 years old and drifting through life like dust on the wind, belonging nowhere and to no one. Ayita had chosen him, not because he was strong or skilled or proven, but because she'd seen something that made her believe he could be more than his history of running. Jakob pushed himself upright. His legs shook so badly he thought he might vibrate right off the log. But he stood, and he took another step, then another, slow, careful, each movement a negotiation with gravity and fear and the screaming certainty that he was going to fall. The far pillar drew closer, 20 feet, 15, 10. The watching crowd had gone silent. Even the children hushed, sensing the razor's edge this moment balanced on. Jacob's vision tunneled. His breathing was too fast, too shallow, 5 feet, 3 feet, 1. His boot touched solid stone. His hand grabbed the pillar. He pulled himself off that log and onto blessed, stable ground, then immediately bent double, gasping, trembling, alive. The crowd erupted. Not in the wild celebration that had greeted Kuruk's crossing, but in something quieter and somehow more profound, respect earned through visible struggle rather than effortless skill. These people understood hardship. They knew what it looked like when someone pushed past their limits. They'd watched Jacob nearly fail, nearly fall, nearly quit, and then watched him refuse all 3 options. But there was no time to recover. Chief Dakota was already leading them toward the second challenge, the cave where the mountain lion denned. The token they needed to retrieve was a specific white stone from the back of the cavern. The lion might be there or might be out hunting. Nobody knew. That was the point. To enter that darkness, knowing you might meet teeth and claws, that you might die in a space too tight to fight effectively, that was courage. The warriors gathered at the cave mouth, a ragged opening in the canyon wall, exhaling cool air that smelled of animal musk and old death. Kuruk volunteered to go first again, making a show of it, laughing as he lit a torch and walked into that darkness like he was strolling through his own lodge. They waited. Minutes dragged past. Then Kuruk emerged, white stone in hand, barely a scratch on him. The cat sleeps deep inside. Do not wake her, unless you wish to die. One by one, the warriors entered. Most returned within 10 minutes, token in hand, moving carefully but successfully. 2 triggered the lion's fury. Jakob heard the roar echo from within the cave, saw both men emerge running, one bleeding from a shallow gash across his ribs. Both had failed to retrieve the stone. Their trials were over. Jakob was among the last to enter. He took a torch from the pile, tested its brightness, and stepped into the cave. The darkness swallowed him immediately, thick, oppressive darkness that the torch barely held at bay. The ceiling pressed low, forcing him to hunch. The floor was uneven, slick with bat guano and moisture. And somewhere ahead, the mountain lion. He moved slowly, torch held high, every sense straining for warning. The cave twisted and turned, growing narrower, until Jacob had to squeeze sideways through passages barely wide enough for his shoulders. His breathing sounded thunderous in that enclosed space. His heart hammered so loud he was sure the cat could hear it. Then he heard her breathing, deep, regular, the sound of a large predator in sleep. The torchlight found her, a massive female stretched across the cave floor, her tawny coat thick and scarred, her paws the size of dinner plates. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, and 10 feet beyond her, placed deliberately in the deepest part of the den. The white stone. Jakob froze. This was impossible. There was no way to reach that stone without crossing directly over the sleeping lion. Wake her, and he'd die in this hole. Trapped, torn apart, his bones picked clean before anyone found his body. The smart move was to retreat, to accept failure in this challenge and hope he could make it up in the third. But 10 warriors had already completed this trial. 10 had proven their courage while Jakob stood here, paralyzed, considering retreat. Again, always, the pattern of his life repeating in miniature. Something in Jacob broke then, not broke badly, broke open. A realization so clear it cut through all his fear. He was tired of being afraid, tired of running, tired of letting fear make all his decisions while he pretended he was being reasonable and careful and smart. Fear had kept him alive, yes, but it had also kept him from living. He extinguished his torch. Darkness crashed down like a physical weight. He couldn't see the lion now, couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. But he'd memorized the layout in those last seconds of light. 10 feet forward. The stone was on his right, the lion between him and escape. Jakob moved in absolute silence, each step placed with surgical care, each breath controlled to near stillness. He'd learned to move quietly in his years of drifting. You don't survive in rough country without learning stealth. But this was different. This was threading a needle in the dark with his life as the thread. 5 feet. He could hear the lion's breathing change slightly. Some shift in sleep, some dream perhaps. He froze mid-step, balanced on one leg, barely daring to exist. Seconds crawled past like hours. The breathing steadied. He moved again. 7 feet. His boot touched something soft. Fur. He'd stepped on the lion's tail. The great cat stirred, muscles bunching beneath skin, and Jakob's entire existence compressed into a single moment of absolute terror. This was death. This was how it ended. Torn apart in darkness because he'd been too proud, too stubborn, too desperate to prove something that couldn't be proven. But the lion settled, shifted position slightly and returned to sleep. Jakob's lungs burned. He'd been holding his breath without realizing it. He exhaled with infinite slowness and took another step. 10 feet. His hand found the wall, searched along the rough stone, found the white rock, smooth, round, about the size of his fist. He closed his fingers around it, lifted it carefully, and began the impossible journey back. Retreating was somehow harder than advancing. Every instinct screamed to run, to bolt for daylight and safety, but running meant death. Running meant waking a predator in her own den with nowhere to escape. So Jakob walked backward through absolute darkness, step by agonizing step, clutching his token, breathing so shallow he felt lightheaded. When he finally saw the cave entrance, that blessed rectangle of daylight, he wanted to weep. He kept his pace steady, unhurried, gave no hint of the terror that had his insides twisted into knots. Only when he emerged into sunlight did his legs give out. He sat hard on the ground, white stone still clutched in shaking hands. Chief Takoda studied him with those dark, measuring eyes. "You were in there a long time. We thought—" He left the sentence unfinished. But Jakob heard what he didn't say. "We thought you were dead." "She was sleeping," Jakob managed. "Didn't want to disturb her rest." Kuruk stepped forward, snatched the stone from Jakob's hand, studied it, then threw it back at him with barely concealed fury. "You survived. That proves only luck, not courage." Jakob caught the stone and met Kuruk's eyes. "Maybe, but I'm still here, and there's still one more trial." The third challenge waited, but first, rest. Food. Time to let his nerves settle from singing at frequencies only dogs could hear. Jakob sat apart from the warriors, eating dried meat and cornbread the women provided, watching the sun track across the canyon sky. His body was a catalogue of pain, yesterday's climb still screaming in his muscles, today's trials layering fresh terror atop physical exhaustion. But he was alive, against odds, against expectation, against the reasonable outcome that he was still here, still fighting, still refusing to quit. Ayita walked past carrying water. She didn't look at him, couldn't, given the eyes watching, but she let her hand trail across the stone wall near where he sat. Her fingers touched a spot, drew his attention to something carved there. Ancient petroglyphs. Symbols Jakob couldn't read but somehow understood. A warrior figure facing a great beast, not defeating it, just facing it, standing firm despite the terror. The message was clear. "This is what I saw in you. not fearlessness, but the willingness to face fear anyway. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when Chief Dakota gathered them for the final challenge of the courage trial. "This test has no physical danger," he explained, "but it will reveal what lives in a man's heart." He led them to a clearing where 3 paths diverged. Each path leads to a different choice. You will walk one path alone. What you find there, how you respond, will show your true character. No one watches. No one judges but yourself and the spirits. Choose wisely. Jacob watched the warriors select their paths, each man disappearing into the brush with confidence or careful thought. When his turn came, he chose the middle path. Not because it seemed safer or easier, but because it felt right somehow. Some intuition he'd learned to trust during his years of survival. The path wound through stands of juniper and pinyon pine, climbing steadily up a rocky slope. After 15 minutes of walking, Jacob emerged into a small clearing and stopped short. 3 scenarios had been laid out, elaborate setups that must have taken hours to prepare. The first, a wounded enemy warrior bound and helpless with weapons laid nearby, a test of mercy or revenge. The second, a cache of valuable items, turquoise, silver, worked leather, left apparently unguarded, a test of honesty. The third, a woman in apparent distress, calling for help in a language Jacob didn't understand. He stood there, understanding the weight of this moment. No one was watching, but that was the point. Character isn't what you do when everyone's looking. It's what you do when nobody would ever know, except you. Jacob approached the wounded warrior first. Up close, he could see it was a setup. The warrior was actually a young Apache man playing a role, the wounds painted on with ochre and ash. But the test was real. The weapons were real. The choice was real. He knelt beside the young man and untied his bonds. In a world where tribes had warred for generations, where vengeance was often the only justice available, mercy was the harder path. Always. But Jacob had seen too much violence, carried too many scars from hatred's harvest. He untied the ropes and moved on. The valuable items glittered in the late afternoon sun. Enough wealth there to set a man up for years, enough to tempt anyone who'd been drifting broke and aimless for as long as Jacob had. He looked at that cache for a long minute, then walked past without touching a single item. The woman called out again, urgency in her voice, fear painted across her face. Jacob approached carefully, assessing the situation. She was young, perhaps 16, and appeared to be trapped with her foot wedged between 2 rocks. Classic damsel in distress. But something felt wrong. Jacob studied the scene and noticed the way she kept glancing toward the bushes, the way her trapped foot could easily slip free if she wanted. This wasn't a test of his willingness to help. This was a test of his wisdom, whether he'd rush in without thinking, whether his desire to be heroic would override his common sense. He called out, "I can see you're not really trapped, and I can see your friends waiting in those bushes. This is a test, and I'm not playing the fool. You want help, I'll help, but not while you're lying to me." Silence, then laughter. The girl's frightened expression melted into a grin. 3 young warriors emerged from the bushes, one of them Chief Dakota's younger son. They spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing and grinning, clearly impressed that Jacob had seen through their setup. He'd passed all 3 tests, not by being strongest or bravest or cleverest, but by being true to values he'd almost forgotten he had. Mercy, honesty, wisdom. When Jacob returned to the village, the other warriors were already gathered. One by one, Chief Dakota announced their performances in the courage trial. Several had failed, choosing revenge over mercy, taking items that weren't theirs, rushing into the trap without thinking. Others had passed 2 of 3 tests. A few, including Kuruk, had passed all 3. "Jacob Kane," Chief Dakota called. The crowd quieted. "You faced the height without your feet failing. You entered the lion's den and emerged with proof. You showed mercy to an enemy, honesty with temptation, and wisdom with deception. You have proven your courage." The village erupted in approval, not the grudging acknowledgement of yesterday, but genuine respect. Even some of the warriors who'd been most hostile now looked at Jakob with new eyes. He was still an outsider, still the cowboy who didn't belong, but he'd earned a measure of acceptance through actions rather than words. Kuruk did not join the celebration. He stood apart, arms crossed, face dark with fury and something else, something that looked almost like fear. Because if Jakob succeeded in the final trial, if this impossible man actually won Ayita's hand, everything Kuruk had assumed about strength and worthiness would be proven wrong. Night fell over the canyon. Jakob sat by his fire, tending his wounds, preparing his mind for what tomorrow would bring. The final trial, the test that would determine everything. And as the stars emerged above the canyon walls, countless and cold and beautiful, Jacob Kane allowed himself something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The third dawn broke with storm clouds gathering over the canyon rim, great dark mountains of vapor that promised rain or worse. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the sky itself recognized the significance of what this day would bring. Jakob woke with his body screaming protest at being conscious again, let alone being asked to perform another impossible feat. The final trial was called the Trial of Will. Chief Takoda explained it as the village gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. Strength fails, courage wavers, but true will endures when everything else has burned away. Today you will face something that cannot be defeated with muscle or bravery alone. Only those with unbreakable spirit will succeed. The trial would unfold in 3 stages, each designed to break a man's resolve in different ways. First, a test of pain endurance. Second, a test of mental fortitude. Third, Chief Takoda smiled grimly, a test of sacrifice. Together they would reveal whether a man had the will to become a leader, a protector, a husband worthy of carrying responsibility for others. 5 warriors remained after the eliminations of previous days: Kuruk, Chaitan, Kohana, 2 others whose names Jakob had learned, Maska and Takoda, 5 men competing for 1 woman's hand. The tension in the village was thick enough to choke on. Everyone understood this was the final reckoning, that by day's end a decision would be made that would ripple through their community for years to come. The first test began with fire and thorns. Each warrior would kneel before a bed of hot coals and place their palms flat against the burning surface. Hold them there while the flesh blistered and the pain screamed through every nerve. Hold them there until Chief Takoda gave permission to remove them. The test was brutal in its simplicity. Could you endure agony for as long as required, not knowing when or if relief would come? Kuruk went first. He knelt before the coals with a warrior's pride etched across his face, pressed his hands down, and his body went rigid with the first kiss of burning heat. Jakob watched the big man's jaw clench, watched sweat break across his forehead, watched every muscle in his body lock in a silent war against the screaming nerves. 1 minute, 2, 3. Kuruk's hands were smoking. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, sickly sweet and horrifying. 4 minutes. Chief Takoda finally nodded. Kuruk removed his hands. The palms blackened and blistered, and stood without a sound. The other warriors followed. Chaitan lasted 3 minutes before the chief released him. Kohana made it to 4.5, his face contorted into a mask of pure agony, but his spirit unbroken. Maska failed at 2 minutes, pulling his hands away before permission was granted, eliminated immediately. Takoda lasted 5 minutes, his silence absolute, his will iron. Then Jacob knelt before the coals. He looked at those glowing embers and felt his stomach turn. He'd been burned before, had the scars to prove it, and knew exactly how much this was going to hurt. The memory of that night, his homestead burning, being trapped in the flames trying to save what couldn't be saved, it all came flooding back. But Aita was watching. The whole village was watching, and more importantly, he was watching himself. This was the moment where he'd discover if all the progress he'd made, all the trials he'd survived, amounted to anything real, or if he was still just a coward pretending to be brave. Jacob pressed his palms to the coals. The pain was immediate and absolute. Every nerve in his hands lit up like phosphorus. His vision went white. His body tried to jerk away, survival instinct screaming that he was destroying himself, that this was insane, that no woman was worth this kind of damage. But he held, jaw clenched so tight he felt teeth crack, eyes squeezed shut against tears that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the body's frantic signals that something was very wrong. 1 minute the pain didn't fade, didn't adapt or diminish. It just kept building, layering fresh agony atop the foundation of suffering already established. 2 minutes. Jacob heard himself making sounds, animal whimpers that leaked out despite his best efforts. Humiliation added itself to the pain. He was breaking. Everyone could see him breaking, not stoic like Takoda, not fierce like Kuruk, just breaking. 3 minutes. His world had contracted to a single point of consciousness. Pain. Nothing else existed. Not the village. Not Aita. Not the future or the past. Just the eternal present of burning. 4 minutes. Something in Jacob's mind snapped. Not broke, but snapped into clarity. This pain was temporary. It would end. But quitting, pulling away before permission was granted, that failure would be permanent. That shame would follow him forever. He'd survived worse. He'd lived through a burning building. He'd watched everything he'd built turn to ash. He'd carried the scars of that night for years. What were a few more scars if they meant choosing his path instead of having it chosen for him? 5 minutes. Chief Takoda was watching him with something like wonder in his eyes. 6 minutes. The other warriors had gone silent. No more jeers, no more contempt, just witnessing something they hadn't expected to see. 7 minutes. Chief Takoda raised his hand. Enough. Remove your hands. Jacob couldn't. His muscles had locked. His hands had fused to the coals through blistered flesh and pain-induced paralysis. 2 warriors had to help him, carefully prying his ruined palms away from the burning surface. When Jacob looked at the damage, he felt his gorge rise. The flesh was charred, blistered in layers, weeping clear fluid. He wouldn't be using those hands properly for weeks. But he'd lasted 7 minutes, longer than anyone except Kuruk, who'd gone 4. No, wait. Jacob's pain-fogged brain struggled with math. He'd gone longer than Kuruk, longer than all of them. The medicine woman rushed forward with salves and poultices, wrapping his hands in strips of soft leather, soaked in something that cooled the burning to merely excruciating. Jacob sat there shaking, going into shock, his body trying to process what his mind had just forced it to endure. Kuruk stood over him. His burned hands were wrapped like Jacob's, his face unreadable. "You should have quit," he said quietly. "Should have failed. Why do you make this so hard?" Jacob looked up at him, vision still swimming. "Because she chose me. And I'm tired of running." Something passed across Kuruk's face, understanding maybe, or recognition. The acknowledgement that they weren't so different after all, both stubborn, both proud, both willing to destroy themselves for a chance at something that mattered. But there was no time for rest, no recovery period. The second test began immediately, the test of mental fortitude. Chief Takoda led them to a grove of peyote cactus, carefully harvested buttons arranged on wooden platters. "You will eat this sacred medicine," he explained. "It will open your minds to visions, show you truths you may not wish to see. You must maintain your awareness through the journey. Return to us with your sanity intact. Those who lose themselves in the visions fail." Jacob had heard of peyote, knew it was used in spiritual ceremonies, knew it opened doors in the mind that were usually locked. He'd never tried it, never wanted to. His mind carried enough ghosts without chemical invitations to meet more. But he ate the bitter buttons as instructed, chewed the awful stringy flesh, swallowed despite his stomach's protests. Then they were led to separate areas, isolated spaces where each man would face his visions alone. Jakob sat on a flat rock overlooking the canyon and waited for the medicine to take effect. 20 minutes. 30. He started to think maybe it wouldn't work on him, and then the world began to breathe. The canyon walls inhaled and exhaled. The clouds above moved in patterns that suddenly made terrible, beautiful sense. Colors intensified until they hurt to look at, and then the visions started. He saw his homestead burning, saw himself younger, desperately trying to save the horses from the barn, flames everywhere, smoke choking, beams falling, saw his father's face in the doorway, calling for help that Jakob couldn't provide because he was trapped, pinned under fallen timber, breathing smoke and watching everything die. The vision shifted. He was running. Always running. Town to town, job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything that might burn, never loving anyone who might abandon him, never risking because risk meant loss, and loss meant pain, and pain meant another shift. He saw Ayita standing in a field of white flowers, but when he tried to reach her, his feet wouldn't move. He looked down and discovered his legs had become roots, digging deep into earth, anchoring him in place. The terror of being trapped warred with something else, the profound relief of finally belonging somewhere. The visions came faster. His scars came alive, burning again, the old pain fresh and immediate. But then hands touched his face, gentle hands, and the pain eased. He looked up and saw not Ayita, but himself, an older version, weathered and wise, looking at his younger self with compassion. You survived, the vision self said. Now learn to live. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the medicine's grip. Jakob rode the visions like a man riding a wild horse, sometimes in control, sometimes just holding on, never quite sure if he'd make it to the end intact. He saw his future children, brown-eyed and brave, saw himself old and scarred and happy, saw a life where the running finally stopped. But he also saw the cost, saw the times he'd fail, the arguments he'd have with Ayita when two cultures tried to merge into one life, the moments when being an outsider would feel like being skinned alive, the slow, hard work of becoming someone worthy of the choice she'd made. The visions showed him everything, the good and the terrible, and the mundane reality that most of life was neither transcendent nor tragic, just daily. Work and love and disappointment and joy all mixed together into something called living. As the sun set and the peyote's grip began to release him, Jacob found himself weeping. Not from sadness, not from joy, from recognition. He'd spent so many years avoiding his own reflection, hiding from the truth of who he was and who he might become. The medicine had stripped away every defense, every excuse, every comfortable lie he told himself. And what remained, scarred and broken and imperfect as it was enough. He was enough. When Chief Takoda came to collect him, Jacob was sitting quietly, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. You returned, the chief said softly. Some men lose themselves in the visions and never find their way back. You are stronger than you know. The other warriors emerged from their own vision quests. Chaitan looked shaken, pale and trembling, clearly haunted by whatever he'd seen. Kahana seemed at peace, smiling slightly, enlightened by his journey. Takoda was stoic as always. And Kuruk looked at Jacob with new eyes, as if the medicine had shown him something about his rival that changed everything. 3 warriors remained in the competition: Kuruk, Jacob, and Takoda. The others had failed, lost in visions or overcome by terrors they couldn't face. 3 men, one final test, and the day nearly gone. Chief Takoda led them to the village center as twilight deepened. The entire community had gathered, every soul in attendance for this final reckoning. The last test, the chief announced, is sacrifice. True will is not proven by what you can endure for yourself, but what you're willing to give up for others. He gestured to 3 items laid out on a ceremonial blanket. A knife, ancient, beautiful, clearly precious. A horse, the finest in the village. A stallion worth more than most men earned in a year. And a small leather pouch containing something Jacob couldn't see. Each of you will choose 1 item, Chief Takoda explained. The knife represents power, the ability to defend and provide. The horse represents freedom, mobility and escape. The pouch contains medicine, healing for any ailment. Choose what you value most, and then you will be asked to sacrifice it for the good of this village. He who gives most completely wins. The 3 warriors stood in silence, contemplating this impossible choice. Choose something precious, then give it away. The cruelty of the test was exquisite. It measured not what you could take, but what you could release. Takoda chose first. He took the knife. Power. He held it reverently, then walked to the village's youngest warrior, a boy of perhaps 15, and placed it in his hands. "May you grow strong," Takoda said. "A noble sacrifice." The crowd murmured approval. Kuruk chose the horse, of course he did. A warrior needed mobility, needed freedom. But when it came time to sacrifice, he hesitated. Jacob watched the big man's internal struggle play out across his face. This horse was worth something, could change a life, and Kuruk's pride demanded he keep what was rightfully chosen. Finally, with visible effort, Kuruk led the horse to the village's oldest warrior, a man too frail to hunt anymore, whose own horse had died the previous winter. He placed the reins in shaking, grateful hands. "For your service," Kuruk said, gruffly. Another murmur of approval, though Jacob noticed it was quieter than for Takoda's sacrifice. Jacob approached the blanket. Only the leather pouch remained. He picked it up, feeling its weight, and Chief Takoda whispered, "That medicine is rare, powerful. It can heal wounds that would otherwise cripple or kill. Use it wisely." Jacob looked at his bandaged hands. The burns were severe, might never heal properly without help. This medicine could mean the difference between crippled hands for life or eventual recovery. Could mean being able to work, to shoot, to provide for a family. He thought about keeping it, about using it on himself. Nobody would fault him. He'd earned it through his choice, and his need was genuine. But then he saw the medicine woman standing in the crowd, saw her weathered face, her skilled hands that had tended every wound in this village for decades, saw the toll that constant healing took on someone who gave and gave and gave, without taking, and he understood what sacrifice really meant. Jacob walked to the medicine woman and placed the pouch in her hands. "You heal everyone else," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time someone gave you the tools to heal yourself." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the medicine pouch to her chest like it was made of light, and the village erupted. Not polite approval, not measured respect, but genuine, overwhelming recognition that they'd witnessed something profound. Because Jacob hadn't just given away medicine that could heal his own wounds. He'd given it to someone else who needed it more. He'd chosen another person's well-being over his own recovery. He'd proven that his will, his character, wasn't about endurance or strength or even courage. It was about sacrifice in its truest form. Chief Takoda raised both arms and the crowd fell silent. He looked at the 3 remaining warriors, Takoda standing, proud, Kuruk looking uncertain, and Jacob swaying slightly from exhaustion and pain and the lingering effects of the peyote journey. "The trials are complete," Chief Takoda announced. "Each man has proven himself worthy in different ways, but one man has shown not just strength, not just courage, not just endurance, but the will to put others before himself, the will to sacrifice without thought of return, the will to become not just a husband, but a partner, a protector, a leader." He turned to Jacob. "Jacob Kane, my daughter chose you before you'd proven anything. She saw in you what we are only now seeing. She chose wisely. If you will have her, she is yours." The world tilted. Jacob's knees tried to give out. He'd done it. Against every odd, against all expectation, against the reasonable outcome. He'd won. Not through being the strongest or fastest or most skilled, but through being exactly who Aita had somehow seen beneath the scars and silence. A man willing to be more than his fear. But before he could respond, Kuruk stepped forward. His face was a complicated mask, anger and respect warring behind his eyes. "I challenge this," he said loudly. "Not the chief's decision, but I challenge Jacob Kane to one final test, hand to hand, warrior to warrior. If he defeats me, I will accept his victory. If I defeat him, the trials continue." The crowd gasped. This wasn't part of tradition, wasn't part of the trials. This was Kuruk's pride demanding one last chance to prove himself, one final opportunity to show that strength still mattered, that the old ways still held value. Chief Takoda looked at Jacob. "You have no obligation to accept this challenge. You have won fairly. You may refuse with honor." Jacob looked at his bandaged hands, looked at Kuruk, a trained warrior in his prime, angry and desperate, looked at the impossible odds of winning a fistfight with ruined hands against a man who'd spent his life learning to hurt people. The smart move was to refuse. He'd won. The trials were over. Accept the victory and walk away. But Jacob had learned something in these 3 days of testing. Sometimes the smart move is the coward's move, dressed up as wisdom. And he was done being a coward. "I accept," Jacob said, and the village exploded into chaos as preparations began for one final, unexpected battle. They cleared a space in the village center as full night descended. Torches were lit, dozens of them, surrounding the fighting ground with flickering light that painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. The entire village crowded around, hungry for this spectacle. Not the quiet, respectful observation of the trials, but something more primal. 2 men, fighting for a woman's hand, for pride, for the right to claim victory. Jacob stood on one side of the circle, trying to shake, feeling back into his bandaged hands. The medicine woman had done what she could, applied fresh salves, wrapped them in clean cloth, but the damage was severe. Every time he flexed his fingers, pain screamed up his arms. Gripping anything was agony. Throwing a punch, he couldn't imagine how that would feel. Kuruk stood opposite, stripped to the waist, muscles gleaming with sweat and firelight. He'd removed his shirt to show off his physique, thick arms, scarred chest, the body of a man who'd spent his entire life preparing for physical combat. He rolled his shoulders, bounced on his feet, ready in a way that Jacob would never be. This was insane. Jacob knew it. Everyone knew it. A burned, exhausted cowboy against a warrior in his prime. The outcome was inevitable. Kuruk would destroy him, probably within minutes, maybe within seconds. But Aita was watching, standing with the other women, her face composed but her eyes bright with, what? Fear for him. Faith in him. The weight of her choice pressing down on them both. Chief Takoda stepped into the center of the circle. "This fight is not to the death," he announced, "but to submission. When one man can no longer continue, when he admits defeat, the fight ends. There are no other rules, no other limits. May the strongest man win." He stepped back. The crowd roared, and Kuruk charged. The warrior crossed the space between them in 3 powerful strides, swinging a punch that would have taken Jacob's head off if it connected. Jacob ducked, barely, felt the wind of Kuruk's fist passing overhead. He tried to counter with a jab, but his burned hand couldn't form a proper fist. The punch glanced off Kuruk's ribs, uselessly. Kuruk's return blow caught Jacob in the stomach. Air exploded from his lungs. He doubled over, and Kuruk's knee came up, heading straight for his face. Jacob twisted sideways, not fast enough. The knee caught his shoulder instead of his jaw, spinning him around, sending him stumbling toward the edge of the fighting circle. The crowd screamed approval. Blood. Violence. The natural order reasserting itself. This was what they'd expected all along, the cowboy broken and humbled, the proper warrior victorious. Jacob caught himself before he fell, turned to face Kuruk again. The big warrior was smiling now, confident, almost relaxed. This would be easy, quick, a formality before claiming the victory that should have been his from the beginning. "You fought well in the trials," Kuruk said, circling. "But this is different. This is what I was born for." He attacked again, a combination of punches, fast, precise, devastating. Jacob blocked what he could with his forearms, took the rest on his ribs, his shoulders, his sides. Each impact sent fresh lightning bolts of pain through his already abused body. He tried to create distance, to bide time, but Kuruk pursued relentlessly, cutting off escape routes, herding him like prey. Another punch caught Jacob in the jaw. His head snapped back. Blood filled his mouth. He'd bitten his tongue. The world tilted. His legs tried to quit. He stumbled backward and fell to one knee. The crowd's roar intensified. Kuruk raised his arms in triumph. "Submit!" he called to Jacob. "You've proven your courage. There's no shame in admitting you cannot win this fight." And he was right. Jacob couldn't win, not in a straight fight. Not with his hands burned and useless, not against a trained warrior who was stronger, faster, more skilled in every way that mattered for combat. And so, beneath the first light of dawn, Jacob Kane stood at the edge of the canyon, no longer a drifter, no longer a ghost haunted by scars and loss. The desert had tested him, broken him, and in the breaking, rebuilt him into something stronger. Beside him stood Aita, the woman who saw the man behind the scars, the heart behind the silence. Together they faced a horizon painted in gold, a promise of peace between 2 worlds that once stood apart. If this tale touched you, partner, don't ride off just yet. Hit that like button and tell us in the comments where in this wide world you're watching from. I'd sure love to know where the wind carries these stories. And if you crave more legends of grit, honor, and the human spirit, saddle up and ride with us again. There are more tales waiting just beyond the horizon. Until next time, keep your heart steady, your words strong, and your eyes on the dawn.